the honor tonight of introducing a premier activist and role model for myself and for justice and people, justice and peace people across the country. Medea Benjamin is the founding director of Global Exchange. She assisted also in the development of a number of national and international organizations to bring to focus human rights issues and abuses. In 2000, she was a candidate for the U.S. Senate in the state of California for the Green Party. Medea is a key figure in the anti-sweatshop and the fair trade movement. Her previous work has focused on improving the labor and environmental practices of U.S. multinational corporations and international institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, and the WTO. For 10 years, Medea was an economist and nutritionist in Latin America and in Africa for the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Health Organization, and others. She has taken her issues on the road of late from Latin America and Africa to Indonesia, China, and most recently, Iraq. She's written 8 books. She's helped produce a number of documentaries. Medea has come to be a significant leader, role model, and a statement about the potential of what it means to be a social activist in a global context. She's truly a global citizen, and she's truly one of my heroes, Medea Benjamin. I'm pleased to give Medea Benjamin our Global Justice and Peace Award in recognition of the dedication to promoting human rights and the tireless commitment to work for global peace, justice, and democracy. With all our hearts, we thank you, we admire you, we support your efforts to create a more just and peaceful future. Thank you, Medea.
How he almost kept the pottery thing for himself. Thank you very much, and I'm really honored to get this award and just delighted to be in the community that has worked so hard for peace and justice at a time when we need a lot of peace and justice in this country and this world. And I wanted to start out tonight taking a look back on the 2 years since the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, because that was the first U.S. response to September 11th. And we don't do much reflecting in this country about what our policies end up doing. In the case of Afghanistan, I would think that if you asked people around this country about that intervention, they'd probably say, well, that was a successful one. Let's look at how to define success. First of all, we were supposed to find Osama bin Laden, right? Anybody know where Osama bin Laden is? Second of all, we were supposed to break up the Al-Qaeda network. Well, we broke up the Al-Qaeda network, but we scattered the network all over the world. So even people in the intelligence community say that it's become harder to find people in the Al-Qaeda network now. The other thing you might remember is that all of a sudden, George Bush and Laura Bush discovered that the women of Afghanistan were oppressed. And so part of the justification for going in there is, in addition to getting Osama bin Laden and breaking up the Al-Qaeda network, we were going to liberate the women of Afghanistan. Well, let's look at the women of Afghanistan. Have they been liberated? First of all, the women of Afghanistan are afraid to go out of their homes because the security situation is so terrible. After the United States invaded that country, for the entire first year said, we don't want to have an international peacekeeping force in this country because they didn't want to get U.S. troops bogged down in Afghanistan because they wanted to have them ready to invade the next country. And so there wasn't a peacekeeping force in Afghanistan, and so the security situation has been, since the intervention and for the last 2 years, absolutely appalling. In fact, Amnesty International did a review recently of the situation in women and say that women are afraid to go out of their homes. Whereas earlier, women were afraid to go out of the markets showing their ankles because they would be flogged. Now they're afraid to go out of their homes because they might be raped or they might be abducted. The other thing that the Bush administration said is that we're going to lift up the people of Afghanistan, make it a prosperous country so that it won't be a hotbed for terrorism. He even used the word Marshall Plan, a Marshall Plan for Afghanistan. I see some people shaking their heads and rolling their eyes, and that's the right response, because it is really so sad to look at Afghanistan today. It continues to be one of the poorest countries in the world. One of the non-governmental organizations, CARE, that's been working in Afghanistan, did a review and said only 1% of the development needs of that country have been met since the U.S. invasion. When you talk about girls going to school, which was something that our government told us we had successfully done, the majority of girls don't go to school. One, because the security situation is so bad, and the other is because they are too poor to go to school. In fact, there's only 15% of children that have access to education, and probably the worst statistic of all is to say that in Afghanistan, 25% of the children die before they reach their 5th birthday. That is not liberation. That is not freedom. And that is not success either. And so when we talk about successful interventions, let's think about how we betrayed the people of Afghanistan. And when the U.S. people were told that was a successful intervention, they were more amenable to the next intervention. And of course, in the case of Iraq, we know we were lied to about the reasons for that intervention. It wasn't about weapons of mass destruction. It wasn't about fighting terrorism. And now we're being told by the Bush administration that it was about bringing democracy to the people of Iraq. And it's true that Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator. It's true that it's good that Saddam Hussein is not the head of that country. But we don't have anything nearly approaching democracy in Iraq. Did anybody listen to the president's speech on Thursday about how we're going to bring democracy to the Middle East? You're all laughing and rolling your eyes for that one, too. I mean, it is a little hypocritical, a guy who was never elected himself, talking about how he's going to bring democracy to the rest of the world. It's a little hypocritical when we have a broken electoral system here dominated by 2 parties that are in the pockets of corporations, when we have an electoral system that does everything it can to keep third parties out, when we have an electoral system that doesn't allow for things like proportional representation or instant runoff voting that would give more voices in our government, a system where we can't even trust the damn voting machines, where the voter registration rolls are purged. This is not really the time when we should be going around the world talking about how we're going to build their democracies. We should do a little introspection and build our democracy here at home. It also must have seemed a little strange to people in the Arab world to hear George Bush talk about building democracy when we're occupying the country of Iraq, when we have been facilitating the brutal occupation that Israel has been perpetrating on the Palestinian people, and when the U.S. has been supporting undemocratic governments in the Middle East for the last 60 years. But let's put all that aside and look at what George Bush said constitutes democracy. So he said a bunch of things, and among some of them were that successful societies are those that limit the power of the military. Now that would be a nice thing, wouldn't it? He ought to tell that to Donald Rumsfeld. He also said successful societies are those that protect the freedom of their citizens. That would be nice to tell to John Ashcroft. And then he said, I think the most interesting thing, which is he said, successful societies privatize their economies and secure the rights of property. And that is really where things are at today. And that is really the reason that this government went into Iraq. Many of us were talking about oil before the invasion, know that that was the prize, but it's bigger than oil. It's much bigger than oil. It's about turning Iraq into a, quote, free market society that would then somehow become a model and have a domino effect for the rest of the Middle East. Well, I was in Iraq before the invasion, and I've been to Iraq twice after the invasion. I'm going again at the end of this month, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about what I have seen, what the U.S. is doing to bring the free market to the people of Iraq. First of all, you might remember about the bombing itself, when they talked about the targeted bombings and how great effort was taken not to hit residential neighborhoods, and that is true. And I think that's something that we ought to take credit for in the peace movement, because one thing that the military was forced to do was to stop the shock and awe campaign and to do a more targeted bombing campaign. But when I went to Iraq, it was the first time that I understood what that targeted bombing campaign did. Because you might have seen on television particular ministries that were targeted. And people were told, well, we targeted the ministries because they represented the stranglehold of Saddam Hussein's regime. But you look at those ministries, and when you're in Iraq, it becomes very clear. Did it really represent the stranglehold of Saddam Hussein's regime to bomb the Ministry of Telecommunications and destroy the ability of Iraqis to talk to each other? To this day, the phone systems for the Iraqis don't work. To this day, Iraqis who have family in other parts of the country, and if they're in Baghdad, they have no way of communicating with their family to know if they're even dead or alive. When you bomb the Ministry of Public Health, was that really bombing Saddam Hussein's regime, or was it destroying what was left of a public health system? Destroying all of the records for the hospitals. When you destroy the Ministry of Education, did that really destroy Saddam Hussein's regime, or did that destroy all the records for what was a free education system that went all the way into postgraduate work? I could go on and on telling you that all the ministries that were destroyed. You could probably tell me the one ministry that wasn't destroyed. Oil, that's right, the Ministry of Oil. And imagine the message that that sent to the Iraqi people to see the Ministry of Transportation and Communication and every other ministry destroyed except the Ministry of Oil. Well, basically what the U.S. did was destroy the basic infrastructure of the country. And not only destroy it with bombs, but then allow the looting to take place. The looting of those very buildings that were bombed, and then the looting became widespread. And you have to question, why didn't the troops stop the looting? The looting wasn't only of government ministries. The looting became looting of major factories and production facilities. And they were looting equipment, like construction rigs and big factory equipment that was worth $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, and taking it out right under the eyes of the U.S. soldiers and spiriting it across the borders right under the eyes of the U.S. soldiers and selling them on the black market. And the U.S. soldiers allowed all of that to happen. It was destroying, once again, the productive capacity of that country. Then on top of that is the massive unemployment that has come as a result of the U.S. invasion. Just look at the Army itself. The Army was 500,000 people. Well, you might say, well, of course you get rid of the Army. That was Saddam Hussein's army. But you know what? That was an army that didn't fight the U.S. That was an army that believed the U.S. propaganda that said, if you don't fight, if you put down your arms, together we will get rid of this brutal dictatorship, and together we will liberate the people of Iraq, and you will be seen as heroes. And the people in the army, and I met a lot of the soldiers, they said, you know what? We believed it. And on top of that, we hated Saddam Hussein because he took us into all these wars. They said he's very much like Bush. He loved wars. He took us into war with Iran, where hundreds of thousands of our comrades got killed. He took us into war with Kuwait, where so many more of our comrades got killed. We didn't like Saddam Hussein. And they said we also knew that we couldn't be victorious over the high tech of the United States. But on top of that, we believed the US propaganda, so we put down our arms. And instead of being welcomed as allies by the US, they were dismissed. So imagine 500,000 people, each one having an average family of about 5 or 6. So you're talking about over 2 million people who suddenly had no income, and you're talking about 500,000 people who were armed and who were pissed. It's not a very smart policy. It's probably the dumbest thing that the US did after the actual dumb thing of invading that country. So dismiss the army. Dismiss the police force, 60,000 police. They didn't just come in and say, we're going to get rid of the bad apples at the top of the police force. No, dismiss the entire police force. So there was no law and order. There was absolute chaos in the streets. People were afraid to go outside. There were rapes, there were abductions, there were carjackings in broad daylight. No law and order at all. And another 60,000 people with no income. Pissed. On top of that, there was this de-Baathification program. They said, okay, people that were a certain level in Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party, they all got to go. Well, you got to recognize, in a dictatorship like under Saddam Hussein, people had to join the Ba'ath Party to get their jobs. So you had thousands of people who were dismissed, fired from their jobs, who were high school teachers, who were college teachers, who were the most highly qualified engineers and electricians who worked in the Ministry of Electricity, the Ministry of Water, that could have gotten the infrastructure back up and running, out on the streets, fired. In fact, I have a friend who has a son in high school. And when school started up, the son went to high school and found that his favorite English teacher and his favorite physics teachers had been dismissed because they were members of the Ba'ath Party. The son was very upset about it, and the father was very upset about it. So he went home and he said, I defied the United States decree that said we weren't allowed to put up pictures of Saddam Hussein, and I decided I would print up a picture of Saddam Hussein and display it prominently at my home. But he said it wasn't any picture of Saddam Hussein. It was a picture of Saddam Hussein shaking hands with Donald Rumsfeld. And he said I had a very important point that I was making, that if we're going to start firing people because of their collaboration with Saddam Hussein, let's not start with the English teacher, let's start at the top. Donald Rumsfeld, and while we're at it, he said, why not Dick Cheney, who when he was the head of Halliburton, was dealing with Saddam Hussein. So there you have hundreds of thousands, no, millions of people who have been thrown out of work, a crisis of unemployment that is now up to 70%. A study done recently by the World Bank says that the economy of Iraq, and this is an economy that was mismanaged by Saddam Hussein and then suffered tremendously from 13 years of inhumane sanctions. But on top of that, this most recent suffering, the economy since 2001 has shrunk by 1/2, according to the World Bank. The U.S. has destroyed the economy of Iraq. Thrown people out of work, destroyed local businesses. Oh, one of the first decrees of the U.S. was to lift all tariffs on goods coming into the country. So you have local businesses that were looted, local businesses that didn't have electricity for 5 months, that had no security, and now they were supposed to compete with goods coming in from China and Saudi Arabia and the U.S. and all over the place. And now, in the course of just 6 months, you go into Iraqi stores, the ones that managed to stay open, and you can't find Iraqi goods anymore. I went in with a woman who is a historian of culture in Iraq to try to buy some Iraqi goods. She wanted to buy a headscarf made in Iraq, like she has bought for generations. No headscarves in Iraq now. They're made in China. She wanted to buy simple things for her home, like tomato paste or soda or canned goods. They weren't made in Iraq anymore. They're now all coming in from all over the world. Destruction of the local economy. But there's one very, very important thing that the U.S. authorities in Iraq did, and that was to decree a change in the investment code. Previously, the investment code had said that foreigners couldn't have majority ownership of Iraqi companies, that they could have minority ownership. They could have only 49% ownership. And it was a way to foster local businesses. It's something that many countries around the world do. Well, the U.S. government thought that was just terrible and changed the investment code. Now remember, this is an illegal invasion, a legal occupation. They put in a puppet government that agreed to changing this investment code. Does anyone want to take a guess at what percent ownership foreign companies are now allowed to have in Iraq? 100%. That's correct. It also said that we would then privatize the companies that were state-owned, because let's go back to what George Bush said, successful societies privatize their economies. So there are about 200 companies that range from electricity to the banks to the mines, basic resources in Iraq, that are now going to be put on the chopping block to be bought by the highest bidder. And let me tell you, the highest bidder is not going to be an Iraqi company. They're going to be foreign companies, and most of them will be U.S. companies. This is ultimately the definition of freedom and democracy that George Bush is trying to bring to Iraq. But you wonder, what about the freedom of workers? Because in those 200 companies that were state-run companies, there are about 500,000 workers. Well, what about the freedom of those workers to fight for their jobs? Aha! Well, there was a law on the books under Saddam Hussein that said workers in the public sector, including state-run companies, did not have the right to unionize, did not have the right to collective bargaining. Well, you can be sure that is a law that the Bush administration decided not to change. In fact, for good measure, they even threw in that they don't have the right to strike. So here you have it, the 200 companies employing 500,000 workers, where workers are really desperate to try to keep those jobs, now do not have the right to organize to try to keep those jobs, to try to stop the privatization of the basic resources of their country. Again, this is the democracy that the Bush administration is trying to bring to Iraq. Well, I want to talk about some of the positive things that we in the peace and justice movement, we with the Iraqis are trying to do. And one is to try to reverse this investment code. It's absolutely essential that we work on this. Right now, most of the Iraqi people don't even know that this investment code was changed. So a number of us in the United States and in other countries that had formed groups opposing the war came together and said, let's set up a center, an occupation watch center in Iraq that will monitor what the occupation forces are doing and try to make sure that they don't put things in place that the Iraqis themselves won't be able to control when they do have, hopefully, an elected government. And so this Occupation Watch Center that we started in July has become a very important place where people are gathering and talking and organizing. And one of the things they're organizing around is to get the word around to the Iraqi people that this investment code now exists, and to start getting people to speak out against it. In fact, this very week we're organizing an economics conference where Iraqis can come together, from small business people to workers to people in the economics department at the university, to talk about what the future would be if the Bush administration were allowed to privatize all of these resources, and how they're going to stop that from happening. So very exciting work that is going on through this Occupation Watch Center. The other thing that the Occupation Watch Center is doing is investigating the companies that have gotten the contracts from the Bush administration. Anybody heard of Halliburton and Bechtel? Anybody want to boo for Halliburton and Bechtel? It is absolutely amazing that these companies have gotten billion-dollar contracts. That's our tax money, and some of them no-bid contracts, and all of them limited bid contracts. Our money to do jobs that Iraqis can perfectly well perform for themselves. And you look at what Bechtel has been, quote, hired to do, that is to rebuild the schools, the hospitals, the ports, the airports. These are things that Iraqis know how to do. You know, there are more PhDs in Iraq per capita than there are in the United States. Iraq is a highly educated population with all kinds of engineers and highly skilled construction workers and architects. And these people are standing on street corners unemployed right now, desperately trying to get jobs, desperate to rebuild their own country. And here they're seeing these U.S. corporations come in and import engineers that they are paying $1,000 a day. That's with the hazard pay, $1,000 a day, when Iraqi engineers would be so happy to be making $500 a month. The U.S. companies are even importing their security guards, and they're paying their security guards $1,200 a day, when Iraqis who know their own country would be delighted to get $250 a month. The U.S. has brought in 800 people as part of what's called the Coalition Provisional Authority to run Iraq. The Iraqis call it the CPA, they call it the Condescending, Patronizing Americans. Out of these 800 Americans, only 17 of them speak Arabic. These are people who don't know the culture, the history, the language, don't even bother to learn it, and they've been put in charge of Iraq. And in fact, I met a number of these people because they hide out in what was the Republican palace of Saddam Hussein and now is the Republican palace of George Bush. And they live in that palace, and they put out their directives from that palace. And many of them are from Texas, like George Bush, and just like George Bush, many of them are failed Texas businessmen. And so they have been sent to Iraq, and they are making a big mess of things. So the Occupation Watch Center is putting pressure on the Coalition Provisional Authority, or the Condescending, Patronizing Americans, to try to get those contracts for Iraqis, to have the work be done by Iraqis. And the way that we are helping in this country is to be putting pressure on Congress and on the administration and on Halliburton and on Bechtel, because we need to cancel those contracts. And that is not impossible, because there is now more scrutiny on those contracts. When the $87 billion was being discussed in Congress, and congressmen like Henry Waxman started bringing people in to testify about where that money was going, and gave out stories like the one you might have heard about the cement factory in northern Iraq, when somebody from the Army put out a bid to a U.S. company and said, what would it take to get the cement factory up and running? And the U.S. company said, I think it would take about $15 million. And then he said, well, let me just for fun ask an Iraqi contractor. And the Iraqi contractor came back with the bid for $80,000, and indeed got the cement factory up and running for $80,000. Well, things like this started coming out in Congress. And then it started to come out that Halliburton was just fleecing us with bringing in oil out from outside Iraq into Iraq. And remember, Iraq has the second largest oil reserves in the world. Importing oil into Iraq as part of U.S. contracts, and charging us twice what it would cost anyone else to import that oil. Well, so much fuss was made about it that just this week, yesterday, that contract was canceled. So working with the Iraqis, doing the investigation on the ground there and getting these issues out here, I think we can get some more of those contracts canceled. In fact, one of the things we're planning here is to do war profiteering hearings in front of the offices of Bechtel in San Francisco and in Texas in front of the offices of Halliburton say no to war profiteering. The other thing that we're doing in the Occupation Watch Center is supporting something that we don't hear about in the United States, and that is the nonviolent resistance to the occupation. We hear every day about the soldiers being killed, about people who are doing armed resistance, but we don't hear about the nonviolent resistance. And so what we in the Occupation Watch Center are doing are supporting human rights groups that wanted to start out post-Saddam Hussein investigating the atrocities of the dictatorship, but instead now find that they have to put their energies into trying to stop the abuses of the occupying forces, going every day to the very prisons that were run by Saddam Hussein and now are run by the US government to find the thousands of Iraqis who are being illegally detained with no charges, with no lawyers, without their families having access to them, and demanding that their basic rights be respected. Working with the families who have had their loved one killed by the US occupying forces because of the indiscriminate use of force that is being used at the checkpoints or when the military is going around on their patrols with their machine guns pointed right at the population. So these human rights groups are working with the Iraqi civilian population to stop the abuses and to resist the occupation. We're also working with workers' groups who, despite the fact that they're not allowed to organize, and a lot of these enterprises are organizing in. And we are accompanying them. We just sent an international labor delegation to Iraq to give them support, both financial support as well as moral and publicity kind of support. There's also a new union called the Union of the Unemployed that is going out right in front of that presidential palace and holding sit-ins and demonstrations and every day and saying, we demand that the jobs be given to us, the Iraqis. That is a way of non-violently resisting the occupation. There's cultural workers who are writing poetry and plays and art, and these are nationalists. These are not Baptists. These are people that just want their country for themselves. And the other area that we are working is supporting women. It's been very sad to see how the position of women has gone backwards so quickly since the occupation. Because unlike in Afghanistan and other places in the Middle East, women were very actively involved in all aspects of society. In Iraq, you had women doctors and women lawyers and women engineers and women merchants and women selling and buying in the marketplace. And now, because of the lack of security and a new wave of rape and abductions, women are afraid to go outside. But women are starting to organize, starting to demonstrate, starting to demand that there be some law and order, starting to demand that women have more of a say in the transition, because the U.S. appointed governing council of 25 people only had 3 women on it, and one of them has been assassinated, because the U.S. commission that was formed to start drafting a constitution had 0 women on it. So women are starting to organize to say, no, this won't do. And in fact, when I was in Iraq the last time, there was a demonstration that women were organizing in that very square where the statue of Saddam Hussein came tumbling down. And as they were putting up their banners and putting up their signs, a patrol of U.S. troops came by, and they saw this activity going on, and they got out of their tanks and with a very menacing manner went up with their machine guns and said, "Who's in charge here?" And the women said, "We're all in charge." And they said, "Okay, who speaks English here?" And this one very petite woman stepped forward. She had lived in Canada for a number of years. And she said, "I do." And he said, "Don't you know, ma'am, that since the occupation, you have to have a permit to gather in Iraq?" And she just kind of looked at him and she said, "A permit in my own country? You gotta be kidding." And then she looked at him and she said, "Where's your permit to be in my country?" These are the kind of feisty women that we must be supporting. So I want you to understand why things are difficult in Iraq. There's also a very exciting sector of the population that is organizing, that is resistant, that doesn't want to see Saddam Hussein back in power, but also doesn't want to see the United States occupying their country. And one thing that we have to look at is what the Bush administration is now calling the Iraqification of the security situation, because they realize with U.S. soldiers being killed every single day, this isn't looking good for Bush's election campaign. And that if it keeps happening, he might be in big trouble. And you also have to recognize that that's why Bush has not attended one of the 380 funerals of the soldiers that have been killed in Iraq, and why they have not allowed any media coverage of the coffins that have been coming home, trying to hide the fact that every day Americans are being killed now. So the Bush administration is now thinking, uh-oh, we got to speed up the training of the Iraqis, we got to put them there in the front lines before the elections. But that means that instead of U.S. soldiers dying for Halliburton and Bechtel, it would be Iraqis dying for Halliburton and Bechtel. And while we might agree with the administration that it should be Iraqis that control their own security situation, that will only work if it is Iraqis, or at least the United Nations, that controls the economy of that country. And that's why we have to put the two things together, the economic issues and the security issues. And that brings me to where I wanted to come now, to talking about how we as a movement have to merge those two issues. Some of you might recall Thomas Friedman, the columnist of the New York Times, who said that you can't have the hidden hand of the market without the iron fist of the military. He said you can't have McDonald's without McDonnell Douglas. And that we are seeing in its starkest of forms in Iraq today. But we see it all over the world. And those of you who have worked in Latin America have certainly seen how the iron fist goes together with the, quote, hidden hand of the market. And so we had been building a movement that was looking at the issues of corporate-dominated globalization and focusing on institutions like the World Trade Organization that was building a secret global government for the benefit of corporations. And many of us were going around the country for years trying to get people to look at these institutions. And lo and behold, when November 1999 came about and the round of the World Trade Organization was meeting in Seattle, tens and tens of thousands of us were out on the streets to say no to global secret government in the benefit of corporate greed. And it's that movement that started around the world to get people organized to say, we don't think that democracy is synonymous with free trade. We don't think democracy is synonymous with privatization. We think that there's something else called fair trade, where people's basic rights are respected, where workers' rights are respected, where communities are respected, where the environment is revered. That's the kind of economy that we want to see. And so we were building up this movement against corporate-dominated globalization and for fair trade when September 11th happened. And September 11th, we were forced to shift our focus onto the issue of militarization and try to stop the invasion of Afghanistan, try to stop the invasion of Iraq. And now we're at a point where those two movements have to come together. And in fact, around the world, those two movements have always been one movement. It's only here in the United States where we are always playing catch-up to the grassroots movements on a global level that we are starting to bring those two movements together. And so we had the round of the World Trade Organization happening in Cancun, where many of us gathered to say no once again to a world dominated by corporate greed, a world that was for the interests of corporate farms that then dumped their surplus on the global south and destroyed the lives of millions of farmers. We said no to that. We said no to a kind of economy that allowed the pharmaceutical companies to keep essential medicines from people who were dying of AIDS or tuberculosis or malaria because they were more concerned about patents than they were about patients. We said no to that kind of economic system. And we were able to come together with the delegates from the Global South and the activists in the environmental community and the women's community and the workers' rights community and the farmers to come together to organize, and for the second time since Seattle, to stop the negotiations of the World Trade Organization. Quite an amazing accomplishment. And here we are now that we have an opportunity, November 20th and 21st, in Miami, when the free trade of the agreement of the Americas is going to be negotiated, to get there by the thousands in the same kind of voice, to say we want to build a different kind of economy. We don't think that free trade agreements are good for the people of this continent. And I think just as we were successful in stopping the World Trade Organization in Cancun, so we can be successful in stopping the free trade of the, agreement of the Americas in Miami. And I hope, are anybody here planning on being there? Not enough of you. But I do see how the Denver Justice and Peace Committee has merged the issues of globalization and militarism, because you have here for people to get themselves to Miami, and right after that to get themselves to Georgia for the fight against the School of the Americas, known better as the School of Assassins. We know that we have to stop militarism and we have to stop corporate-dominated globalization. And so I think that while some people might be feeling a tad bit depressed at this moment in the United States, when we came out by the millions on February 15th, here in this country and around the world, in one beautiful movement that said, the world says no to war, and what did Bush call us? A focus group? It can get a little depressing when the government doesn't listen. But we are part of a global movement, and that global movement represents the majority of the world's people. And after February 15th, there was an article 2 days later in the New York Times that some of you might recall, because it was probably the most significant thing we'd ever read in the New York Times, and that was when they said, there are now two superpowers, there's the United States, and there's global world opinion. We are part of that global world opinion. And when we're feeling that we are a minority in this country, that we are fringe, why don't people in this country wake up and see the destruction that the Bush administration is bringing to us in this country, our own communities, our own economy, as well as people around the world? Take heart in the fact that millions and millions of people around the world do see that. And let's look at the successes that people in other parts of the world are doing. And let's look at Bolivia. Let's look at a country that is among the poorest in the world, where people who are miners and people who are campesinos and people who have no access to computers and Palm Pilots and all the amenities of organizing we have here in this country, they said no to the privatization of their water, they said no to the privatization of their natural gas, and guess what else they did? They said, we will get rid of a government that doesn't represent the best interests of its people, and they did. Well, that's a very good lesson for us at home, isn't it? And that brings me to election year, because we have an amazing opportunity this election. We know that Bush has two big problems. One is the economy, and the other is Iraq. And we know that Bush is trying to manipulate the fear of the American people, and will try to do it again as it comes closer to the elections, to get people to vote for him. And one of the most crass ways they're doing it is by having the Republican convention to be held in New York City as close as they could get to the World Trade Center, as close as they could get to the date of September 11th. And they are starting their convention on August 29th in New York City. And we are saying that we need to get 1 million people out in the streets on August 29th in New York City to say that that strategy, that callous strategy of preying on the fears of the American people will not work. It will backfire. We will make sure that that strategy backfires. Mark in your agenda books August 29th and try to get yourselves to New York City to be part of the 1 million-person outpouring against George Bush. But we're also going to make it a week of activities and organizings and social forums and all kinds of wonderful things that will be happening. And our friends in other parts of the world have said, we want to be part of that as well. We want to organize solidarity demonstrations. They said, we also think that because we are all now part of this empire, we all have a stake in this vote, and so maybe we should organize a global vote on the empire. So we were doing electronically a global vote on the empire and having solidarity demonstrations on August 29th for, under the slogan of, the world says no to the Bush agenda. Close on a very positive note because I really do feel that we are at a very moment this time in history when there is two very different visions of the world that are being pitted against each other. One is the vision of the world that's represented by the Bush administration that says democracy and freedom equals free markets, equals privatization, equals the freedom of corporations to go anywhere in the world, destroy local communities, destroy environments, and that is the definition of freedom. That is a worldview that cannot survive. We have pitted against that the global majority that is saying that we must build a world that's economy is not based on corporate greed, but is based on the needs of people and the need to preserve the environment, an economy that says that we are determined that there be no starving children, an economy that says anybody is suffering from a disease for which there is a cure must have access to that cure, and a world community that says we don't believe in preemptive strikes. We believe that there should be no countries in the world that have weapons of mass destruction, including ours here at home. And a world community that says we don't want secret global government for the corporations that's represented by the World Trade Organization or the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. We want global institutions that represent the needs of the people. We want the Kyoto Accords. We want the International Criminal Court. We want to have the Convention on the Rights of the Children signed. We want the International Labor Organization rights of workers to be signed and respected by all countries. These are the kind of international institutions that we want to build up. And so I think that here in the United States, where we are playing catch up with the global world community, we have to take heart in the fact that we are part of the global majority, that the global majority has a beautiful and very moral vision of the world, and that we here in the United States are on the move as well, that we are determined that we will have a government in this country that represents the will and the needs of the people of this country and the people of the planet. We are determined that we will have a government in this country that understands, especially in a post-9/11 world, that you cannot fight violence with violence, you cannot fight hate with hate. Only look at Israel to see the results of that. But a world that respects international law and that understands that the only way we're going to make ourselves safe here at home is instead of bombing other countries, we show kindness, we show generosity, and we show love. And that is what will make us safe, and that's what will build a safer world. So let's get out there and build the world of love and kindness, generosity that we would like to see, and let's make sure we put somebody in the White House who represents that as well. Thank you very much.